Hello, my name is Benjamin Hart. I'm an American attorney and the managing director of Integrity Legal here in Bangkok, Thailand. As the title of this video suggests, we're discussing the Thai Communicable Diseases Act, and I'm going to go ahead and we'll put this up. This is a screen. This is from the Bangkok Post print edition, Thursday, September 23rd, 2021. The article is titled, "Curfew Power Carries Over." And this is pretty substantial, in my opinion, legal news going on out here. So the byline is New Act to Supplant Emergency Decree. Quoting directly from relevant portions of this, and I urge folks who are watching this channel, go check this out online on bangkokpost.com. Check out this article because a lot going on in here. And I'm going to try to do some analysis. I've discussed this with legal staff here in the office. To the extent that there is speculation here, yes, it's speculation. We don't know exactly what's going to transpire in coming months, but we're just kind of providing some, legal insight based on what's being announced. Quoting directly, an amended Communicable Disease Act will grant the National Committee on Communicable Diseases authority equivalent to that of the emergency decree the government said yesterday. Well, that is huge. We've been under an emergency decree that is very broad-reaching. I mean, I hesitate to use the term totalitarian because it's kind of cliche, and I don't know that it quite encompasses all the nuance here. But the system we've been under this emergency decree, there's a reason it's an emergency provision. It's not anything like, standard operating procedure here in Thailand. It certainly, in my opinion, doesn't have a very democratic flavor to it. It's essentially, as they say right here, the National Committee on Communicable Diseases. Well, that committee has had a tremendous amount of day-to-day power over people's basic freedoms and over basic aspects of their lives. I mean, to the point of micromanaging very, very tiny elements of how people go about their lives and do business, etc., as well as major things like business closures, etc. Quoting further, the draft executive decree now awaits parliamentary endorsement, and I'm going to get back to that. Parliamentary endorsement. Really like to know what that means. Quoting further, and publication in the Royal Gazette before coming into effect, a government house source said. Well, the Royal Gazette, for those who are unaware, I kind of liken the Royal Gazette to like the Federal Register in the United States. It's the publication of record, and that's, in a sense, kind of a formality associated with any regulatory or legal change here in Thailand. But again, and I'm going to come back to that. I just want to quote this again. The draft executive decree now awaits parliamentary endorsement. I'll come back to that in a minute. Quoting further, the draft decree will likely be forwarded to Parliament for endorsement when the new parliamentary session begins in November, as the government appears unlikely to request for a special session specifically for this purpose, said the source. I was very curious when reading this. Does parliamentary endorsement mean a debate? Does it mean a parliamentary discussion? Is there some truncated fast lane of processing that's going to come about to promulgate this into law? This is a major, major change. This is not just a finite amendment to the Communicable Diseases Act that will pertain to some very narrow subset of the way life is run. No, the way this looks is the emergency decree made permanent. That's what it looks like to me. I mean, that's a major legal change to what we had prior to March 2020 here in Thailand. We did not have this CCSA, this National Committee on Communicable Diseases. We did not have a permanent sort of sitting committee that got to sort of micromanage our lives prior to that. Now, an emergency decree was invoked per the law, and we've had to deal with that. And I'm not saying there's anything good, bad, or indifferent about that state of affairs. That's just has been what it's been, but it's been under the old rules. And presumably, they've had to renew this every couple of months because it's not meant to be permanent, which begs the question, is it a good idea to make it permanent? Quoting further, and I noted this, as soon as a serious communicable disease is declared under the amended Communicable Disease Act, the Prime Minister, who will become the chairman of the National Committee on Communicable Diseases, is granted authority equal to what Prime Minister Prayut Chan-o-cha currently has as the director of the Center for COVID-19 Situation Administration, CCSA, said Deputy Prime Minister and Public Health Minister Anutin Charnvirakul. So I want to read that again. As soon as a serious communicable disease is declared, what does that mean? What is the definition of a serious communicable disease? Bear in mind, at the beginning of this whole situation, again, going back into March 2020, it was only, in my recollection, and don't hold me to sort of the triggerings of how this all went down, but it wasn't until a pandemic was declared by WHO and then subsequently, actions were taken here in Thailand to deal with that we actually saw the invocation of the emergency decree and the promulgation of things like the CCSA and all of the different rules we've had to deal with for the past roughly year and a half. It was my understanding that the sort of key moment, the inflection point, the catalyst, if you will, the triggering mechanism was that declaration of a pandemic. That's what I thought. That was my understanding. Meanwhile, now, under this amended, so the amendment is going to change whatever it was. The amendment will say, as soon as a serious communicable disease is declared. Well, how is that declared? Who declares it? Does Parliament do that? Does the person that's going to chair the committee do it on their own? Who does that? Who declares that? That's a question I'd like to have an answer to. Quoting further, aside from the authority to impose a curfew and lockdowns, the committee's chairman will also have the authority to order any state agencies to cooperate with the committee in containing such a serious public health emergency, Mr. Anutin said. So I kind of like how it's just sort of brushed off, well, aside from authority to impose curfews and lockdowns, arguably the most intrusive thing humanity's maybe had to deal with in the last 70-odd years. Now, I'm not pointing fingers only at Thailand here. You can look at the U.S., Australia, Europe, all these places where just curfews and lockdowns. I mean, what's the problem there? But then on top of that, the authority to order any state agencies to cooperate with the committee. I mean, that's a lot of power. That's a substantial amount of power. So quoting further, and they're quoting from Dr. Riwat Wisutwet, a Thai Liberal Party list MP, quoting directly from Bangkok Post, he added that he had some doubts about the emergency decree's overall effectiveness in containing the pandemic. Well, I've got my doubts too. As I've noted in other videos on this channel, I have real doubts about the efficacy of lockdowns. I would really love to see the data that proves that has worked particularly well. It's worked really well at hurting the economy. There's no doubt about that. But as far as containing or having any kind of impact on the overall situation, I fail to see where that's occurred. But okay, reasonable people can disagree, and maybe I haven't seen all the data. I'm perfectly happy to stand corrected on something like that. But the emergency decree's overall effectiveness, I mean, so what? We make it permanent? It hasn't worked thus far. Let's just do it forever. Is that the line of logic? I don't really understand the reasoning behind this. It's meant to be an emergency decree. It's meant to be an emergency state of affairs that's invoked. Well, if the emergency no longer exists, why are we keeping it? If the emergency is still going, okay, we just keep the emergency decree going on the 2-month basis that it's gone to this point. Why does this need to be made permanent? And why is it apparently now going to change? It looks to me like we're going to have a different standard for even invoking this. Again, a serious communicable disease is declared. Well, as we've discussed in other videos on this channel. I did the data, I did the numbers. It's roughly 1.8% of the population at that time had gotten COVID, and of them, about 1% had died from it. You know, if that is considered a higher level disease than a serious communicable disease, I mean, what can this ongoing emergency be based upon? The declaration that sneezing is a problem or something? I'm not trying to be funny. I'm not trying to be snarky, but these are major powers that are created and that are promulgated and that could become permanent under this kind of an amendment. And I'm just wondering if everybody's really thinking all this through, you know, especially in the long run. And a good point somebody brought up, I was discussing this with, you know, in the Western context, and again, not everything's about the West. I'm a Thai. I very much respect Eastern thinking as well, but sometimes there's good things from both sides. And I was talking to somebody about, in the context of American politics, there's kind of a saying that says, don't ever do what you don't want your enemy, your political opponent, to do to you. So the thinking is, don't vote in legislation that creates a substantial amount of power, okay, for you at the moment, but you may not always be in the majority. You may not always be the one that's calling the shots. Do you really want to have to deal with that same, you know, that same instrument wielded by your political opponents? It's always a good question. And just a final note, again, the draft executive decree now awaits parliamentary endorsement. I'd really like to know what that means. I really hope this is seriously vetted before a final decision is made on this. I really hope people sit down and think for a substantial period of time and take a big, deep breath and try to think reasonably outside of the recent hysteria that we've had to deal with the last 18 months. Because the fact of the matter is, this would be a substantial change to the jurisprudence of Thailand. It could have long-lasting implications, and I don't think it should be undertaken lightly.